She's gone from being a vilified royal mistress to the woman who will now shape the future of the monarchy, Camilla Parker Bowles.
She has gone from being a vilified royal mistress to the woman who will now shape the very future of the oldest monarchy on earth. But today, that power is crumbling under the weight of a sin so dark it cannot be hidden anymore. Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, thought she had secured her legacy, but her son, Tom Parker Bowles, has just unexpectedly become the target of the most rigorous, cold-blooded, and secret investigation in royal history. A seismic shock erupted when the sacred Sandringham estate, a place of peace for the late Queen, was discovered to have been turned into a private, filthy playground where Tom stealthily brought in underground tycoons to entertain them in exchange for suitcases of dirty, untraceable money. But the ultimate outrage, the one that makes the blood of the British public boil, lies not just in his insolence, but in the one who stood behind him to cover it all up. Queen Camilla herself. She dared to use the sacred name of the family to force the entire palace staff into a wall of silence, blatantly bypassing King Charles's authority, believing she was untouchable. However, these dirty octopus tentacles were severed when Prince Edward, the silent guardian of the dynasty, unexpectedly intervened. With the acumen of a seasoned spy and the cold heart of a protector, Edward seized fatal evidence. A shady payment invoice hidden deep at the bottom of a secret cabinet and a high-definition video from a micro-camera capturing the entire scene of Tom taking a massive bribe right in the antiquities vault. Ironclad evidence was released, pushing the throne into a violent tremor that no one expected. Will King Charles be ruthless enough to deliver a punishing blow and throw his betraying wife out on the street? What public humiliation will Tom face when the handcuffs finally snap shut on his wrists? And what will Edward do to entirely eradicate these parasites from the palace forever? The atmosphere at St. James's Palace was suffocating. A private party for the elite was taking place, where classical music played rhythmically and sparkling glasses of champagne were passed around by waiters in pristine tailcoats. Prince Edward stood silently in a dark corner of the room, hidden behind a massive marble pillar, holding a crystal glass with no wine inside. He never mingled with the crowd. He only observed. In a dynasty suffering so many wounds, Edward had turned himself into a shadow, an unblinking eye that saw everything the others missed. From the main doors, Tom Parker Bowles walked in. He did not possess a single drop of royal blood, yet his stride was more arrogant and domineering than anyone else in the room. The crowd automatically parted as if a king had entered. Tom walked straight toward Edward, raising his glass and deliberately exposing a dazzling, limited-edition diamond-studded Rolex watch on his wrist. The sapphire crystal reflected the sharp light of the chandelier, a luxury item that his meager writing career could never afford. It was a symbol of the dirty money flowing into his pockets from the shadows. Tom stopped right next to Edward, the distance close enough to be a threat. He pulled down the lapel of his expensive bespoke suit jacket, revealing a gold-rimmed magnetic card peeking out of his pocket. That was a highest-level security card, an exclusive item only granted to members of the direct bloodline to access the king's most private vaults. Edward stared at the card, his eyes turning into ice. Tom smirked, leaning in close to Edward's ear to drop a chilling sentence. He said that the portraits of ancestors hanging on the walls were merely lifeless objects that did not produce actual stacks of cash, and that in this era, bloodline is just an obsolete concept for dreamers. The one who holds the locked doors is the one who rules the game. Edward did not reply. He didn't blink. His absolute composure caused Tom's smile to stiffen. But the moment Tom turned his back, Edward's hand gripped his glass so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silent hunt had begun. A few hours later, at 2 in the morning, while the world slept, the Sandringham estate was welcoming uninvited guests. A black-tinted SUV slithered through the side gate. There were no guards. The checkpoints had been neutralized in advance. Tom Parker Bowles stepped out, swiping that gold-rimmed card. The heavy steel bolts retreated, and the door to the restricted antiquities vault swung wide open. Behind Tom, 3 strange men stepped out, carrying heavy black leather suitcases. They were underground tycoons and smugglers, men ready to pay piles of cash to touch historical artifacts for their own base egos. They stomped their shoes on 100-year-old Persian carpets and blew cigar smoke at the portrait of Queen Victoria. They were turning the most sacred place of the family into a filthy black market. But they didn't know that Prince Edward was already moving. Before the sun rose, Edward's armored Range Rover tore through the fog. He didn't use the main gate. He used a royal mechanical spare key to enter the vault. Inside, under the cold light of his ultraviolet flashlight, the scene appeared like a festering wound. The floor was covered in scratches from heavy suitcases. Edward knelt, finding a layer of cheap wax used to hide the damage. The staff had been forced to clean the battlefield before dawn. He found the smell of cheap Cuban cigars clinging to the velvet curtains. Then, he found it. Under a marble statue, a tiny object flashed. Edward picked it up with steel tweezers. It was an artificial diamond, the kind used by the nouveau riche who lack class. The royals would never use such trash. It was a physical link to the intruders. Without wasting a second, Edward headed to the security room. He found the duty officer asleep and accessed the server. The cameras had been turned into static for 3 hours, manually disconnected. But the culprits made a fatal mistake. They couldn't erase the physical access log on the offline hard drive. Tom's card had left a digital footprint. Edward took photos of every digit and timestamp. He had the scene evidence, but he needed more. He needed the document that would bind the puppet master. At midnight, he slipped into the head butler's office, using a lockpicking kit. He found a false bottom in a desk drawer. Inside was a black notebook and a stack of invoices. The numbers were staggering. VIP guest, Antiquities Vault, 3 hours, £250,000. The most sacred rooms were being rented by the hour. But the killing blow was a handwritten order inside the notebook. Open doors according to the family's directives. No records. At the bottom was a red wax seal. It wasn't the king's seal. It was the personal seal of Queen Camilla's office. She was the ringleader. She was the one protecting her son while he sold the family's honor. Edward's hands remained steady as he scanned every page. The trap was now fully loaded. He knew a notebook might not be enough to overthrow a queen, so he decided on a direct strike. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Edward installed rice grain-sized microcameras inside the giant crystal chandelier of the vault. These were military-grade tools, invisible to palace scans. 4 days of tense silence passed until, at 2:15 a.m., his phone vibrated. The live stream showed Tom entering with a Russian billionaire on a sanctions blacklist. The billionaire opened a suitcase full of 50-pound notes. In exchange, Tom used a stolen key to open the tempered glass cabinet, lifting out the late queen's original pearl necklace. As the tycoon touched the priceless pearls, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was Queen Camilla. She wasn't surprised. She nodded in confirmation to the billionaire. She was the one pulling the strings. Edward saved the video. The crime was recorded. The next morning, Edward marched toward the king's quarters with an iPad full of evidence. But a giant figure blocked his way, the king's head bodyguard. The man threatened Edward with a taser and smashed the iPad, thinking he had destroyed the truth. He sneered, saying the queen had paid him 10 times his pension to keep the king blind. But Edward only smiled. He pulled out a small USB drive. He told the traitor that the iPad was only bait. The real data was already being broadcast live onto the 85-inch television inside the king's bedroom at that very moment. The bodyguard turned pale. The silence in the hallway was broken as the bedroom door flew open. King Charles stepped out, his face crimson with a fury no one had ever seen. The betrayal by his own wife had cut deep. He didn't need a trial. He looked at the treacherous bodyguard and jerked his chin. Elite Royal Guard operatives lunged forward, throwing the traitor to the floor and dragging him away like a dog. The purge had officially begun, and no one, not even the Queen, was safe from the storm that Edward had unleashed. The storm that had been brewing in the hidden corridors of Buckingham Palace finally made landfall, and the destruction was absolute. As the head bodyguard was dragged away, his boots scraping helplessly against the stone floor, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the hallway. King Charles stood there, his chest heaving, holding the small USB drive Edward had handed him as if it were a live grenade. The fury in the king's eyes was no longer just about the money or the stolen artifacts. It was about the ultimate violation of a husband's trust. Inside the king's private study, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and the metallic tang of high-stakes tension. Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, the very desk where his mother had signed historic decrees, and stared at the flickering screen of his private monitor. On the screen, the image was frozen on Queen Camilla's face, that slight, triumphant nod she gave to the Russian billionaire. It was a look of cold calculation that Charles had never seen directed at the world, only now realizing he had been sleeping next to a stranger. Prince Edward stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the morning light, watching the king's reaction. He knew that for the monarchy to survive, the heart of the rot had to be cut out, even if that heart belonged to the queen. Suddenly, the double doors of the study burst open. Camilla rushed in, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her silk robes flowing behind her like the wings of a fallen bird. She didn't look like a queen anymore, she looked like a cornered animal. She began to speak, her voice a high-pitched frantic warble, claiming that the video was a deepfake, a sophisticated digital assassination attempt orchestrated by enemies of the crown. She pointed a trembling finger at Edward, accusing him of jealousy, of trying to destabilize the king's reign for his own gain. Her performance was masterful, filled with tears and appeals to the decades of loyalty she had shown Charles. She knelt by his chair, grasping his hand, begging him not to believe the lies projected on the screen. But Charles remained as still as a statue. He slowly pulled his hand away from her grip, an action that spoke louder than any shout. He didn't look at her, he only looked at the screen. Edward stepped forward, his voice a calm, lethal contrast to Camilla's hysteria. He didn't argue, he simply opened the black notebook he had recovered from the false bottom drawer. He began to read the dates, the times, and the specific amounts of money listed next to the codes for the antiquities vault. He reached the page with the red wax seal, her seal. He held it up to the light, showing the microscopic imperfections that proved it was authentic, not a forgery. Camilla's voice died in her throat. The color drained from her face until she was the shade of bone. She tried to pivot, changing her story in mid-air, claiming that Tom had been coerced, that he was under threat from the Russian mob and she was only trying to protect her son. She painted herself as a desperate mother, not a criminal mastermind. But Edward was prepared for this move. He played the second part of the audio recording, a hidden clip from the microcameras where Camilla was heard discussing the percentage she expected from the sale of the late Queen's pearls. There was no mention of protection, only profit. The king finally spoke, his voice a low, guttural growl that made the glass decanters on the side table vibrate. He ordered the immediate lockdown of all of Camilla's private accounts and the seizure of her communication devices. He commanded the royal security detail to begin a full audit of every gift and artifact moved in the last 6 months. Camilla tried to protest, to invoke her status as queen consort, but Charles cut her off with a single sharp wave of his hand. "You are not the queen of this house today," he said. "You are a witness to a crime against the crown." Outside the palace, the chaos was just beginning. The paparazzi, tipped off by Edward's network, were already broadcasting the images of Tom Parker Bowles in handcuffs. The headlines were writing themselves, "The Prince of Thieves," and "The Queen's Shadow Market." The public's reaction was a tidal wave of outrage. People who had already been skeptical of Camilla were now calling for her total removal from the royal line. Back inside, the interrogation shifted to Tom, who was being held in a secure room in the basement of the palace. Unlike his mother, Tom broke quickly under the cold gaze of the military investigators. He started naming names, revealing a network of corrupt staff members and external facilitators who had helped him bypass security for years. He admitted that the Sandringham incident was just the tip of the iceberg. There were other estates, other private collections that had been skimmed for years. He pleaded for a deal, offering to testify against the tycoons in exchange for a lighter sentence, but the investigators only stared at him with contempt. They weren't looking for a deal, they were gathering the nails for his coffin. While Tom was confessing, Edward was busy purging the palace staff. He had a list of every person who had accepted a bribe or looked the other way. One by one, they were summoned and stripped of their credentials. The palace was being cleaned from the inside out, a brutal but necessary surgery. Camilla was moved to a separate wing, guarded by soldiers who took no orders from her. She spent the night pacing the floor, watching the news reports of her son's disgrace, realizing that the walls she had spent a lifetime building were now her prison. The betrayal was so deep that even the usual royal fixers, the men who make problems disappear, refused to take her calls. She was radioactive. The next morning, a secret council was convened. The king, Prince Edward, and the highest-ranking legal advisors of the realm met to decide the fate of the queen. It was a scene straight out of a medieval history book, but with the high-tech reality of the 21st century. They discussed the legalities of exile and the stripping of titles. There was no talk of forgiveness. The evidence was too overwhelming, the public anger too dangerous to ignore. Edward argued that any leniency would be seen as weakness, a signal that the royals were above the law. He insisted on a complete and total severance. The king, though visibly heartbroken, nodded in agreement. The decision was made. Camilla would be removed from public life immediately, her staff dismissed, and her presence erased from all upcoming state functions. She would be sent to the Scottish Highlands, to a remote estate that had once been used for royal isolation. There would be no cameras, no jewelry, and no sun to comfort her. As the sun began to set on the second day of the crisis, a small, unmarked convoy of black vehicles lined up in the palace courtyard. This was the end of the line for the woman who thought she had won it all. The final curtain was about to fall on the most scandalous chapter in the modern history of the British monarchy. As the unmarked black convoy waited in the cold courtyard of Buckingham Palace, the engine's low hum sounded like a funeral dirge for a reign that ended before it truly began. Queen Camilla stood by the window of her temporary confinement, her eyes hollow, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears she no longer had the strength to cry. The palace, once her fortress of power, had become a labyrinth of judgment. Every servant who once bowed to her now looked away. Every corridor she once walked with pride now felt like a path to the gallows. Prince Edward entered the room for the final time. He didn't bring guards. He didn't need them. His presence alone was the embodiment of the law she had tried to subvert. He carried a single velvet tray. On it lay the formal documents of abdication from all royal duties and the permanent revocation of her access to the sovereign grant. Edward's voice was as cold as the Scottish wind she was about to face. He told her that her son, Tom, had already been moved to a high-security facility, where he would await a trial that would be televised to the world. There would be no royal intervention, no secret pardons, and no mercy. Tom had become the sacrificial lamb for the sins they had committed together. Camilla tried to speak, to offer one last bargain, but Edward simply placed the pen on the tray. "The king has already signed his heart away, Camilla," Edward said. "Don't make him sign your death warrant too." With a trembling hand, the woman who would have been the power behind the throne signed away her life. The moment the ink dried, Edward took the papers and nodded to the two female officers standing at the door. They stepped forward, not with the deference shown to a queen, but with the efficiency of jailers. They stripped her of the last symbols of her status, the royal brooch, the silk sash, and the signet ring. She was led out through the back service entrance, the same entrance used for garbage and deliveries, a final humiliation orchestrated by a king whose love had turned into ash. As she was ushered into the back of the black SUV, she looked up at the king's balcony. Charles was there, a lonely figure in the shadows, not waving goodbye, but simply watching the cancer being removed from his house. The convoy sped away, disappearing into the London fog, heading north toward a life of silence and isolation in the Highlands. Back inside, the purge reached its absolute peak. Edward sat with the king in the war room, going over the final list of the cleansed administration. Over 40 staff members had been dismissed. 3 high-ranking officials were under house arrest. The monarchy was smaller now, but it was pure. The message was sent to the world: the crown is not for sale. The stolen antiquities from Sandringham were being returned to their vaults, but the late queen's pearl necklace remained on the king's desk, a broken circle of pearls representing a broken family. Edward looked at his brother, the king, and saw a man who had aged 10 years in 3 days. But he also saw a king who was finally free from the whispers of a traitor. The public announcement was made at noon. The palace released a brief, clinical statement citing permanent retirement from public duties for health and personal reasons, but the world knew the truth. The images of Tom in handcuffs and the leaked audio of the percentage talk had already gone viral. The monarchy's reputation was in tatters, yet there was a strange sense of respect growing for the king's decisiveness. He had chosen his duty over his heart. Prince Edward, the man who stayed in the shadows to save the light, was now seen as the true architect of the new era. He didn't want the crown, he only wanted the throne to be worthy of the people. In the final scene of this tragedy, we see a drone shot of the remote estate in Scotland, a grey stone house surrounded by nothing but mist and jagged rocks. Camilla is seen walking alone on a barren moor, no longer draped in silk, but in a heavy, anonymous wool coat. There are no cameras to catch her smile, no crowds to cheer her name. She is a ghost haunting her own life. Meanwhile, in London, King Charles and Prince Edward stand side by side at the opening of Parliament. The air is clear, the rot is gone, and the silent hunt is over. But the scars will remain forever. The parasites were eradicated, the traitors were jailed, and the king remains, stronger, colder, and utterly alone. Do you believe King Charles made the right choice by exiling the woman he loved to save the crown? Was Prince Edward's spy-like intervention a heroic act or a cold-blooded power play? The shadow of this scandal will loom over the palace for generations. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Is this the end of the monarchy as we know it, or a necessary rebirth? Don't forget to like this video to support the truth and subscribe to our channel for the most explosive royal updates. Click the video on your screen now to see the secret history of the king's other hidden enemies.